History 101, Lecture 3, Colonial South, Development of Slavery in Virginia and Carolinas. What we're going to talk about here is different types of unfree labor in the Chesapeake region in the colonial South. Of course, there's free labor, people contracting to work for wages. We're going to focus on the unfree labor part of colonial Virginia and Maryland in the 1600s. There's the first type of unfree labor we'll talk about is during the colonial era, there are some enslavement of Indian groups or Native American groups. For example, the Creek Indians or the Creek tribe would sell their POWs to families in the Carolinas and Virginia. And so some Native American tribes and English settlers would trade in slaves. Of course, the biggest issue with maintaining a slave system involving Native Americans is the inability to maintain the slave system. An Indian gets enslaved, his friends can just come get him. It's just where they live. And so easy to escape, easy to, get away and free yourself in some ways. The second type of unfree labor we're going to discuss is indentured servitude. The definition of indentured servitude is it's contract labor. You sell your labor for 5 to 7 years, depending. You negotiate a contract with the owner or boss or person you want help from. You negotiate a contract. You sell your labor for a period of 5 to 7 years. In exchange, you get free passage to the American colonies, British North America. And depending on what you negotiate at the end of your contract, your boss or now owner is supposed to give you things. It can be items as simple as clothes or a house or money or land. It can be something as simple as money or clothing. It can be something as complex as land or house or whatever you negotiate with the boss or owner now. Being an indentured servant, while it's contract labor, you come to America. Generally, an indentured servant, you have very little individual rights in colonial America. Your boss or owner, he's an owner. He has control over your labor, and in many ways, your life and every aspect of your life. And so, for example, an indentured servant in colonial America, can't vote, can't marry without the owner's permission, can be punished in various ways. It's kind of open. Generally, the indentured servant can't serve on a jury, can't, do various things in political life. One of the few rights you have is you are able to sue in court, and that is, we're going to go over legal cases in a minute, and you'll see that. It's not a glamorous life. It's very difficult. You're hard at labor. The general purpose of indentured servants was to perform agricultural labor, tobacco, mainly tobacco in the 17th century, but then other crops as well. And so tobacco planting is labor intensive. It's hot, it's humid. The owner can provide for you as little or as much as he wants. If you're a female indentured servant, you'll generally be subject to providing services other than your labor. There's a good percentage of female indentured servants that during their tenure of service, became pregnant unwanted. You can be whipped, beaten, slapped, poorly treated, I guess, physically. So it's not it's not a glamorous life. It's very difficult. When historians study the statistics of indentured servants, one historian noted that about three-fourths, about 75% of indentured servants did not get the negotiated settlement at the end of their term of service. Often you're just kicked out, and so that's going to leave a large number of you know people, young men, angry and penniless. Which if you've already studied some aspect of colonial America, you know about Bacon's Rebellion. One of the big catalysts of Bacon's Rebellion is you had a large group of landless, poor, former indentured servants who felt screwed over by their economic betters. In colonial Virginia, most three-fourths, 75% of indentured servants are men, because again, the purpose of indentured servitude is mainly agricultural labor. So you want healthy, young, large, strong men to perform the agricultural labor. The third aspect or third form of unfree labor that we want to discuss is the development of African slavery in Virginia. So you have some enslavement of Native American groups, you have indentured servants, and then now we're going to talk about the development of African slavery. Now, the last time we talked about the Atlantic slave trade was in the 1440s in Lecture 1. Lecture 2. In Lecture 2, The Rise of Europe, we discussed the development of the Atlantic slave trade with the Portuguese in West Africa in the 1440s. We then left it there, and then we talked about some other things, and so now we're back. We're in the early 17th century, so about 150, 160 years later. Let's look at what's the form of unfree labor in the Western Hemisphere in the New World. African slave labor is, in the Atlantic slave trade, is the system in the Caribbean, Spanish America, and Portuguese Brazil. What we see in the New World is in places in the Caribbean, Spanish America, Portuguese Brazil, we see African slave labor being used. For most of the New World, the Western Hemisphere, and the primary form of labor is African slavery. And by the 17th century, the early 1600s, we see the Dutch. The Dutch are the primary importers of African slaves in the New World, kind of passing the Portuguese. What we're going to look at next is we're going to go into a greater discussion, or in-depth discussion of the development of slavery in colonial Virginia, and we're going to use a handout. I have included the handout in the Canvas page that you'll find this lecture on, but I'm going to also go over it here if I can pull it up. There you go. Okay. And so, Lecture 3 handout, timeline of development of slavery in Virginia. And so we start with maybe the second most famous date in American history, behind 1776, perhaps. The first Africans in Virginia, in Jamestown, Virginia. And so we, it's a popular date, I guess, for U.S. history. And what we want to do is we want to study the development of these first Africans in the American colonies in colonial Virginia, and then trace the legal journey from indentured servitude to lifetime servitude, which would be slavery. When you study this first group of Africans in colonial Virginia and their descendants, we note that the status of Africans in colonial Virginia is ambiguous. You see indentured servants that are freed. You see indentured servants that turn into lifetime servants. You see Africans that are freed and do really well. We're going to talk about one big example, Anthony Johnson. You see Africans that are freed and just kind of left homeless and penniless like their white counterparts. Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion in the 1670s included both European and African former indentured servants. So early on, we see it's ambiguous. The status of an African in colonial America is ambiguous. And so we can see, as we study the legal journey, the legal cases in the court system over the ensuing decades, we can trace the development from Virginia mainly focusing on indentured servitude until at least the 1640s, and then some historians even estimate up to the 1660s. The number one form of labor in colonial America was indentured servitude. And so that's while the rest of the New World used African slave labor, the main form of labor in colonial Virginia, at least for the first few decades, is indentured servitude. And so when we study the legal journey, we can see that change for Africans. And then we see the eventual disappearance of indentured servitude. And so we'll go over that. So the legal journey, so 1619, most of the first African group were legally considered indentured servants. The biggest piece of evidence for that is that's the legal status of unfree labor in colonial Virginia. When you read, you look at the laws and the statutes and the legal system in Virginia in 1619, unfree labor is indentured servitude. You have a contract, and you live out that contract. You're freed, and so that's the number one thing. That's the legal system in colonial Virginia. There is, when you study the primary documents, there is one documented exception. There is a legal document where it lists a woman named Angela who was born in Africa, based on the legal documents that's extant. Angela was an African who was brought to colonial Virginia, and she is recorded as a lifetime servant. And so, and that's another interesting piece of information for these early Africans and also early Europeans who are indentured servants. Colonial Virginians early on, there's that distinction. Are you an indentured servant or are you a lifetime servant? An indentured servant is freed after a time period. A lifetime servant is obviously for your lifetime. And so early on, we see most are indentured servants. We do have a notable exception found in a primary document. A woman named Angela is listed as a lifetime servant. In 1624, the story of William Tucker. William Tucker is an early colonial African, and actually he would be African American at this point. So, we went over it in an earlier lecture. Virginia Dare is considered to be the first English person born in the American colonies, European or English-born colonies. You have Virginia Dare, D-A-R-E. Back in the 1570s, 80s. So William Tucker is considered the first African born in what would be considered the 13 colonies. So, that is what it is, I guess. I'm not big on firsts, but historically, so you have Virginia Dare is considered to be the first English person born in what would become the 13 colonies. Kind of the first European American, I guess you could say. William Tucker is interesting because he's generally considered to be the first African born in the 13 colonies. William Tucker's parents were indentured servants to a man named Captain William Tucker. And so when you study the documents of the era, we see that William Tucker's parents were listed as indentured servants to Captain William Tucker. He happened to be a diplomat to native tribes in the region. When you study property records and legal documents, it is noted that around 1635, property records indicate that after they were freed around 1635, William Tucker's parents bought and developed a farm in what's today Kent County in Virginia. And so this William Tucker story is again that example of ambiguity. You have Angela, lifetime servant, a slave. You have William Tucker and his parents being indentured servants, freed, and even listed as owning. They own property. They buy a farm. You know, they're African. William Tucker's African American. You could say they own a farm. And they develop some property. And so there's that ambiguity early on. In 1628, there is records indicating a Dutch ship landed at several ports in the Virginia colony, transporting Africans. These are considered slaves, and so by 1628, you have importation of Africans where they are lifetime servants. They're not indentured. They're lifetime servants. And so you see that ambiguity. You see indentured servants, you see lifetime servants, you see free, you see slave. Some of those black indentured servants are going to become free and do something with, live a free life, own a farm. Others are going to be left penniless and homeless and will participate in Bacon's Rebellion in the 1670s. When you study the 1620s, you get to the 1620s. By the 1620s, legal historians note there's at least 7 Virginia court cases during that era involving African indentured servants who are suing for their freedom. And so that's interesting. Okay, the court hears their cases. These men. If these men thought they were slaves and they had no rights and they're lifetime servants, they wouldn't have thought, hey, I can go to court and sue. So this indicates in the culture there is a attitude or a view among people that, listen, I'm an indentured servant. I can sue for my freedom based on contract. And so you have that. In 6 of the cases, the defendants, the owner, argued that they were bound for life. And so you start to see this idea of, well, are they indentured servants or are they lifetime servants? And so again, this highlights kind of the ambiguity of the era. These 7 men, they happen to be all men. These 7 men suing are, they have in their head that I'm not a lifetime servant, I'm an indentured servant, and so I can go to court and I can sue for my freedom. Anthony Johnson is probably the most famous American intentionally ignored. I would say. In my 23 years of teaching college, this is my 24th year. In my 23 years of teaching college, he's probably the most famous American intentionally ignored by historians. And so I definitely talk about him here, so you can have a full story. And again, Anthony Johnson, he's an interesting story. Here's a man who is brought to America, foreign, he's black, he's dark skinned in a society that's European. And he makes something of himself. What I find interesting is that he should be celebrated. He's someone who started out at the bottom, so to speak, and he became a pretty large landowner in Colonial, Virginia. To me, he's a story of success. I find it interesting that people want to ignore him and bury him. He's an inspirational story of someone who Started out, quote unquote at the bottom, and became one of the biggest landowners in colonial Virginia. So Anthony Johnson's an interesting story. He is an indentured servant. He is listed as an indentured servant coming to the Virginia colony around 1621. While he is in his term of service, he'll marry a lady named Mary. As you can see, she worked on the same plantation. According to legal documents, she's listed as an indentured servant as well. And so you see this plantation. Anthony and Mary they're African, from Africa, and they're indentured servants. We believe they were, based on the historical evidence, meaning the primary documents, they were freed around 1635. We see Anthony Johnson on his own entering the legal record around 1647, as you can see, where he bought a calf. So, and he's listed as an unindentured free man. And so here you have an African, not like the Mary lady, lifetime servant, going the way of William Tucker, and William Tucker's parents, freed, and you could buy some land. He's listed in 1651 as purchasing 250 acres for, and for many of us who are urban oriented, you may not realize how big 250 acres is. That's massive. Like, for example, a family farm, a farm where a man, for a family, a man, maybe 6, 7, 10 kids could farm, would be 20 to 40 acres. Growing up, one of my grandpas had a farm of 40 acres. It was a sizable chunk of land to farm. He had the citrus orchard. My dad and all my uncles worked quite a bit, and my aunts too. They worked quite a bit to run a 40-acre farm. So, you may not, we hear 250 acres, is that a lot? If you've never had any connection to rural life, 250 acres is massive. It's big. Again, a family farm is only 20 to 40 acres. So, Anthony Johnson had a couple of kids, and by the late 1650s, those two sons are listed in court records as owning a combined 550 acres. So here you have, black or African American or black or African individuals owning quite a bit of land, right? Anthony Johnson, what's interesting about him is Anthony Johnson had both white and black indentured servants, and he even had lifetime African servants. And so, that's, for me, that's one of the reasons why he's kind of buried. It's an uncomfortable, for some, it's an uncomfortable thing. A black person owning another black person, and even a white person. Anthony Johnson had, based on historical records, he had European and African indentured servants, and he even had lifetime servants as well. Johnson will die in 1670, and we'll come back to him and talk about him a couple more times. And so he's a very interesting story. I think he's well worth study. By the 1640s, we noticed something interesting. By the 1640s, there are dozens upon dozens upon dozens of cases of English and African runaway servants. Okay. When you study early 1600s Virginia court records, that's like almost the number one, judges in colonial Virginia, that's almost the number one case they deal with is runaway servants. So it's a pretty interesting thing. They're like always dealing with runaway indentured servants. What's interesting is, for historians, is noticing when European indentured servants are sentenced for running away and Africans are. It is invariably, with very little to no exceptions, when you study the court records of Virginia in the early 1600s, European indentured servants are always sentenced to some more years, like 5 to 10 years. Okay. Um, African indentured servants are almost always sentenced to lifetime servitude. Okay. And so historians note that is a trend. It's an obvious trend. White indentured servants are European indentured servants, almost always, 99% of the time, sentenced to 5 to 10 years. A term is, in other words, they're going to be freed eventually. The most common sentence for African runaway indentured servants is lifetime servitude. And so that's interesting for historians. Another interesting thing about this idea of, the ambiguity of Africans in the early 1600s, the fact that the judge is sentencing Africans in lifetime servitude tells you something. Okay. If a black American or an African American or an African during this time, if they are already considered lifetime servants or slaves, there would be no reason for the judge to sentence them to that. You get it? And so the fact that judges are sentencing Africans to lifetime servitude for their crimes tells you that in the culture there is some ambiguity. An African or a black individual or an African person or African American is not considered automatically a slave. If they were, a judge wouldn't be sentencing them to lifetime servitude. They already would be. He'd be sentencing them to something else, like whipping or cutting off their foot or whatever. And so that's an interesting little clue about the status of Africans during this era. The fact that judges are sentencing them to something that tells you, for a lot of these African indentured servants, they're not considered lifetime servants. So when they get sentenced for running away, they're given that. John Punch is another interesting individual. John Punch on the legal records. John Punch on the legal records is a runaway. While running away, he was also convicted of stealing, a criminal offense. And so that's why, in John Punch's case, he was an African indentured servant. His case is criminal. So running away wasn't considered criminal, considered a civil crime. John Punch, when historians study him, his case is actually criminal. He stole. While running away, he stole some of the property of his owner. And so when he goes to court, when you study his court case, he's charged with running away, but he's also criminally charged for theft. And he will be given a sense of lifetime servitude. And so for historians, this is an example of the first or the beginning of this idea that if an African individual or a black individual commits a crime, he can be sentenced to lifetime servitude. Next we have 1655. Anthony Johnson again crops up in the legal records. This is an interesting case. Anthony Johnson is sued. A disgruntled neighbor of Anthony Johnson, didn't like him, and so took him to court and sued him on behalf of a guy named John Casser. John Casser is listed in the records as an indentured servant of African descent. Anthony Johnson in the legal documents is listed as a free man of African descent. The neighbor was suing Johnson, stating that Anthony Johnson was keeping a indentured servant past his time of servitude. Anthony Johnson's defense is that John Casser is a lifetime servant. And so the judge finds in the favor of Anthony Johnson. And so Castler is considered to be, you have a judge, previous to this, an African is sentenced to lifetime servitude. This is considered to be one of the first cases, or the first where a judge is legally declaring somebody a lifetime servant. Okay. Well, and another reason why this case is important is there's no law. When you study Virginia records, the statutes at the time, there's no law abolishing or adopting slavery as a legal system. And so in other words, you don't have an overarching legal case where the statutes that a judge can turn to and declare somebody's status. And so what we see here is a judge saying John Castler is legally a lifetime servant. So Anthony Johnson wins this case, and he gets to keep Castler. 1656 is another extremely interesting case. A woman named Elizabeth Key sued for her freedom. She is an African servant. Based on the primary documents, there's no contract for it. We can't find. There's no contract whether she was a lifetime servant or an indentured servant. But in a way, it doesn't matter because it's what is Key suing on. Elizabeth Key, when she goes to court, she's not suing based on contract. She sues for her freedom based on her parentage. Her dad was European. And so what you're seeing here is by the 1650s, you see a change in culture, right? Elizabeth Key isn't suing based on contract. Previous Africans they go to court, they sue based on contract. I'm an indentured servant, I should be freed, right? What's very significant about this is you see a woman who she's African American. Based on the record, she was born in Virginia, and so you have this woman, Elizabeth Key. She was born in the colonies, and so what's her status? She sues for her freedom based on European parentage, her father, and she actually wins her case, and so she is freed. We don't have any drawings or paintings or TikTok videos ever. I'm just kidding. We don't have any evidence or knowledge of like exactly what she looked like, whether she would have passed for European or not. But the court, though, very interesting. The judge finds that, well, okay, if you're European, that is some basis for you being free. And what's interesting again, you're seeing a shift in the culture. The judge isn't looking at contract. Do you have a contract saying you're in free labor or not? Right? He's not sentencing Elizabeth Key to lifetime servitude. The judge buys the argument that somebody that's European cannot be a lifetime servant. Okay, you're free. Okay, so you're seeing that shift, right? You're seeing that shift, and then thinking about Europeans, like say European, like an European indentured servant at this time. Think about what they're thinking. Wait a minute, I'm European, then that means I can't be a lifetime servant, right? And so you're getting this idea: European indentured servant can be freed over time. An African individual or a person of African descent, lifetime servant. 1661, the Virginia Colonial Legislature, the House of Burgesses, finally gets around to making a law on it, allowing a citizen to legally own a lifetime servant. And so, what do you notice interesting? There's already been decades of the courts, case by case, adjudicating an individual status, right? Sentencing you to lifetime servitude. Like John Castler, okay, you're legally a slave. The Virginia Colonial Legislature, the House of Burgesses says what? is legally okay for a citizen to own a lifetime servant in the colony of Virginia. In 1662, the Virginia House of Burgesses sets forth another piece of legislation differentiating between Africans that run away that are indentured for a time and lifetime servants. And so, what are you noticing here? What we're saying here is after decades, we're in the 1660s now, right? We're 5 decades after 1619, right? And so we're now decades in. The ambiguity needs to disappear from at least the colonial legislature's point of view. What do you notice? They're getting rid of the ambiguity. You're setting up the legal status of Africans in the colony. There's too much ambiguity. 1662, the Virginia colonial legislature sets the status of African children as the same as their mother. And so, again, you're getting rid of that ambiguity. Could the colonial legislature be thinking of Elizabeth Key? Several years earlier, Elizabeth Key sued and won her freedom based on what? Her European parentage, her dad. Interesting, the court says, well, your status is based on your mother. And interestingly enough, if that law had existed when Elizabeth Key sued, she wouldn't have won her case, right? Because her parentage is based on her dad, not her mom. 1667, Virginia law states that baptizing an African slave does not exempt them from bondage. And so just being baptized doesn't mean you're not a slave anymore. And so you see they're getting rid of that ambiguity. Okay. So finally in the 1660s, after several decades, you see the decline of European indentured servitude. You see the decline of African indentured servitude. Enslavement of Indians doesn't work. And so you're seeing the colony of Virginia turning to African slave labor, the Atlantic slave trade. 1668, again, you're trying to legally define the status of Africans. Well, what about free Africans, right? Negro women, though permitted to enjoy their freedom, they have to pay taxes. So you gotta pay taxes. Anthony Johnson again. Again, another reason to study Anthony Johnson is over his lifetime, you can see the change in that status, right? You can see the change in the status of Africans in colonial Virginia. Anthony Johnson died in 1670. He was born sometime in the 1610s, so he's around 60 years old. His estate, Anthony Johnson owns several hundred acres of land, a house, and slaves, as well as indentured servants, white and black indentured servants and African slaves. This is what's interesting. His estate, his will leaves it to his sons. Okay? What does the court do? The court gives his property to another European, to another European colonist, not to Johnson's children, as the will stated, ruling that Johnson was not a citizen of the colony because he was African, therefore doesn't have a right to have his estate go through probate and given to his children. It is actually given to a European neighbor, not necessarily the one that sued him 2 decades earlier, but so you have that again. And so what you see there is you see the change. By 1670, you see the courts, or at least one court, saying what? Well, Africans aren't citizens of the colony; they're slaves, and so they can't go to court and they can't go through probate and get property. So you see this change, right? Decades earlier, just 2 decades earlier, Anthony Johnson himself is winning court cases, right? Now, 15, 20 years later, when he dies, the court goes, another court, but a court goes, well, he's He's African. He's not a citizen of the colony. Okay? And so you're seeing that shift. European indentured servitude is disappearing. We don't see enslavement of Indians, Native Americans. We start to see African slave labor as the predominant form of labor in the colonies. And closing it out, Virginia law sets the legal standard of what is a slave. It's any non-European imported into the colony who does not have a parent who's a baptized Christian. So you see that 1682, okay, well, who's a slave? You're setting the legal standard. If you're not a European, so if you're African, and neither parent was a baptized Christian, you're a slave, right? So it gets rid of the ambiguity. You're getting rid of the ambiguity. You can't, in other words, you can't, in the eyes of Virginia law, you can't be a free black or a free African, because if you're imported into the colony, right? So there you go. Okay, and so that's that. The next thing I want to talk about really quick is we want to develop slavery in the Carolinas. While slavery develops over time, there's some ambiguity, and then ambiguity disappears by the 1660s. In the Carolinas, African slavery is transplanted. British Caribbeans who come from the British Caribbeans, leaving the Caribbean to come to the Carolinas to settle, bring their African slave labor. Okay, African slave labor through the Atlantic slave trade already exists in the Caribbean. It's been established for 150 odd years, right? You don't have indentured servants in the Caribbean. You don't need them. There's African slave labor. Okay. And so slavery in the Carolinas is transplanted. By the 1650s or 1650s, 1660s, you see African slaves brought into the colony. It's not a coincidence, those of you that are awake, it's not a coincidence that what? It's not a coincidence that right around the time that British Caribbeans bring their actual African slave labor, the legal status of a lifetime servant into the region, it's not a coincidence that the Virginia Colonial Legislature what? Tightens up its slave system. That's not a coincidence. Okay, right? You're seeing a group of people enter a region with their labor that is not ambiguous. So you don't want that unfree labor to come north to Virginia where you might be free. Okay. And so it's not a coincidence that the Virginia Colonial Legislature sets its legal status of Africans right around the same time that British Caribbeans bring their slave labor. Okay. Early Carolinas, just here's a fun map. This is where the Carolinas were. So motivations returning to African slave labor through the Atlantic slave trade. By the 1660s, you see a decrease in European indentured servants. You see an increase in the availability of African slaves. Fears of growing number of landless freemen. Think about it. Right? Bacon's Rebellion. Okay. It is unwise. Okay. It is unwise politically. It is unwise to what? Create a group of angry, upset, landless men who feel they've been screwed over. Because what might they do? Burn things down. Okay. Bacon's Rebellion. Okay. Bacon's Rebellion is a massive example of that. In the 1670s, fears of growing number of landless freemen. It's not really smart. It's not really smart to create a group of pissed off men who feel like they've been screwed over by the man. Because what might they start doing? Burn down the man's stuff. Okay. So you turn to African slave labor, more easily controlled. You can control it. If they get angry and rise up, you know, you can shoot them. You can control them. You can, you know, you're not. You can kind of psychologically beat them down to where they can be more controlled. You leave a bunch of landless freemen running around, they're going to do something about it. All right. And then you have an available supply from the Caribbean. Okay. Here's the Atlantic slave trade map. You can see where most go. Look at 32%, a third of Africans go to Brazil. Caribbean next. About 4% of Africans from West Africa go to the British colonies. So, massive, massive. This little map, or graph, not a map, this graph shocks students. Students are usually shocked. Look at the small number. Estimated number of Africans imported to British North America in the 1700s. Look how small it is. Over a decade. 9,000, 10,000, 9,000, so a pretty small number. By the American Revolution, it gets a good chunk, 69,000. And so what does that tell you? That tells you what? The African, or by now African American population in the colonies is what? Is growing through natural reproduction. And historians note that black or African American or African women are having about the same number of children as their European counterparts, and so the birth rate's high. Okay, and there's Virginia, kind of where settlement is. Thank you for visiting. Have a great day.